Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special meeting of the Rigu Kogu, the Estonian Parliament. My name is Jüri Ratas, and I'm the Prime Minister of Estonia. And joining me here today are parliamentarians Mr. Yevgeny Ozanovsky from the Social Democratic Party, Ms. Kaya Kallas from the Reform Party, Mr. Raymond Kodjelait from the Centralist Party, and finally, Mr. Hilaire Cedar from the Conservative Pro-Patriot Party. Today, we have gathered to discuss the issue of inequality and social mobility in Estonia. But before we dive into that, let's first discuss the three main economic indicators in the Eurozone. Mr. Cedar?
Absolutely. The euro area headline inflation rate has been steadily decreasing. Now, as of March 2019, it has dropped to 1.4%, as shown on slide 2. This is well below the ideal 2% inflation rate, which could mean an increase in the unemployment rate in the short term. Meanwhile, core inflation has remained low but steady at around 1%.
One cause of this drop may be because the ECB ended large-scale asset purchases in December 2018. Also, TLTROs from 2016, which are cheap bank loans provided by the ECB, are nearing maturity, meaning that banks holding these loans will have to pay them back to the ECB. This decreases the number of loans banks can make because the reserves drop, which could also dampen inflation.
I definitely agree, Ms. Collis, but a larger cause for the recent drop has been due to falling oil prices, which were at its lowest level in December 2018 at $44 per barrel. However, as prices begin to rise, we can expect upward pressure to be applied on both core and headline inflation, possibly bringing it back to around 2%. If this drop were to persist, however, this is concerning as it decreases consumer confidence.
Considering the recent disinflation, is the ECB taking steps to fulfill its mandate of keeping inflation close to 2% in the medium term?
Yes, it is still maintaining extremely low-key interest rates and intends to do so until at least the end of this year. It will also create new TLTROs in September 2019.
On the bright side, unemployment in the Eurozone has seen big improvements. As shown on slide 3, it is currently at 7.8%. Keeping unemployment low is important because it lowers the cost of welfare programs for nations. Employed people can also use their income for consumption, increasing real GDP growth.
However, youth unemployment in the Eurozone is still nearly double the regular unemployment rate, at an average of 16.1% in February 2019, as shown on slide 4. Although this rate has decreased from over 17% back in January 2018, the high rate could still have future negative impacts on GDP growth.
As shown on slide 5, the annual GDP growth rate in the Eurozone fell to 1.1% in January of this year, its lowest level since 2015. The ECB has even cut its growth forecast from 1.7% to 1.1%, well below the 3% target, as shown on slide 6.
Besides the end in QE spending and oil prices fluctuating, this decrease in growth can be blamed on trade tensions with the US, specifically tariffs on aluminum and steel. Also, a slowdown in growth in Asia has led to fewer exports, not to mention general consumer restraint.
These, however, are not the only problems facing the Eurozone. The possibility of a no-deal Brexit, Italy's recession, the refugee crisis, and rising nationalism could all significantly decrease economic growth for the Eurozone.
Now that we've discussed the current economic situation in the Eurozone, let's turn our attention to Estonia. As you all know, and as shown on slide number 7, we have a small population of 1.3 million people, and we're a part of the Soviet Union until 1991. Since then, our country has experienced a tech revolution, and we now have more startups per person than the Silicon Valley. Much of this has to do with our amazing education system. We have nearly free tertiary education and the highest PISA score in all of Europe.
Today, we are showing strong GDP growth, inflation, and unemployment numbers at 4.2%, 2.3%, and 4.4% respectively. And while we were hurt by the financial crisis of '08, austerity measures coupled with entrepreneurial activity helped create a speedy recovery. Estonia adopted the euro in 2011, and we now have the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the Eurozone, as at just 8%, well below the Maastricht Treaty maximum of 60%, as shown on slide 8. I, for one, am proud of how far we've come.
Unfortunately, these numbers don't tell the whole story. Our nation suffers from poor social mobility. As seen on slide 9, Estonia's Gini coefficient is at 31.6, which is the 7th highest in the entire Eurozone. Clearly, we need to address the income inequality that exists in our nation.
I agree. I believe the problem stems from our income tax system that disproportionately favors the rich. It's absurd to have a flat 20% tax rate on everyone. We must increase taxes for the rich. I say that we increase the rate on those earning between 2,501 euros and 3,100 euros from 20% to 23%, and the rate on those earning above that wage range to 25%, as indicated on slide 10.
Those rates are preposterous. Considering the sudden change from a 20% rate to a 25%, the wealthy will surely decide to migrate elsewhere.
Actually, Mr. Cedar, these rates are still well below the OECD average of 36%. In fact, our neighbor Finland places a 51% income tax on the rich. The increased rates also won't affect business growth, as we still offer 0% interest on all reinvested earnings and have many unique tax code benefits, which we will not disrupt.
If nobody else has anything to add on this matter, I say we should take a vote on Ms. Collis's proposal to raise taxes for those who are part of the top 2 income brackets. All in favor, please raise your hand.
I guess I do agree, as long as we maintain our current tax benefits for businesses. Growth won't go down the drain on my watch.
I now think we should focus on our gender pay gap, which is the worst in the Eurozone. In addition to prejudice, this gap exists mainly because our high-paying and fast-growing technology sector is dominated by men. This issue must become our main priority for today.
Not necessarily, Ms. Callas. Although I do agree that the gender pay gap is a problem, several Estonian organizations, including Tech Sisters and DigiGirls, have already established programs that encourage women to enter into the STEM field. And since 2013, there's been an average decrease of 1.4% every year in the gender pay gap, as evidenced on slide 11.
I agree with Mr. Ratas on this one. In my opinion, a much more salient problem is our out-of-control poverty. In 2017, a staggering 22.6% of our population lived at risk of poverty. And in 2018, we had one of the highest poverty rates in the Eurozone, as seen on slide 12. Higher poverty rates leads to increased crime and reduced productivity, preventing an economy from reaching its potential GDP. We must address this issue now.
I agree, Mr. Ozanovsky. Without a steady source of income, people in poverty are unable to pursue higher earning jobs, preventing social mobility. Social mobility is critical to the growth of the economy, as it lessens a strain on welfare resources, which allows for flexibility in government spending.
If we're going to tackle poverty, we should first figure out what has caused it. In other nations, educational disparities are a big cause, but as you mentioned earlier, Estonia already has low-cost education for all. Instead, it's older workers who do not receive this education that we must consider, as shown on slide 13. An appalling 37.5% of Estonia's seniors lived at risk of poverty in 2017.
But why put so much stake in this issue? We must preserve our low debt to GDP ratio, and to give handouts to the poor with no economic benefit whatsoever could ruin our future growth prospects.
Mr. Cedar, aside from the clear obligation we have to aid the poor, there are economic benefits to reducing senior poverty. High senior poverty leads to increased healthcare costs for our country, which is especially unsustainable as our old age dependency ratio is already at 56 and growing. Younger Estonians with financially dependent elderly parents will also decrease their consumer spending. So if we want to maintain our strong GDP growth, reducing senior poverty is essential.
We need to help our seniors stay productive and financially secure by improving our support system for them, as shown on slide 14. Our current system simply does not provide enough for those lacking personal retirement savings.
However, I do applaud Mr. Ratas for recently approving a reform that encourages more seniors to work while also expanding pensions. Unfortunately, this plan won't go into full effect until 2037. In the meantime, we should complement this reform by providing seniors with easy access to medical checkups and food.
We can provide these services by creating resource centers throughout Estonia, especially in places with a high density of poor senior citizens, such as Tallinn and Tartu. These centers will work with local businesses to provide food banks, weekly doctor visits, cultural activities, and job counseling.
That's a great idea, Mr. Kajulade. I think your proposal will allow seniors to have a higher disposable income, especially since food is often the largest portion of household budgets for the poor. By combining with other facilities and services, we can also reduce the stigma surrounding food banks.
What's the point in investing so much in these resource centers, considering the problem will diminish over time?
These services we're providing are not just for the elderly. These resource centers will always be of use, as anyone in need for food banks or job counseling will have it at their disposal, as seen on slide 15.
Actually, I don't know if I'm completely on board. While I do support these centers, I think we're forgetting about a separate group of older seniors who can no longer work and won't benefit from job counseling. I say we also include another program for seniors who can apply to have an increased pension fund of 600 euros a month instead of the current 400 euros.
That's a ridiculously high amount to provide people, and I refuse to support helicopter money solutions like this one. What evidence do we even have that the solution will reduce the poverty rate?
This solution can actually be based off the United States Supplemental Security Income Program, which provides monthly cash distributions to seniors and the disabled. It has been proven to have lifted over 500,000 seniors above the poverty line in the U.S.
We can fund our programs using the revenue from our increased taxes on the top two income brackets. Estonia's low debt to GDP ratio also gives us more room to spend on these programs. I think that we need to tackle senior poverty now instead of letting it grow worse.
Now that we've addressed the funding issue, it's time for us to take a vote on these resource centers and increased pension payments for specific disadvantaged seniors. All in favor, please raise your hand.
No, I just cannot support this plan with the increased pension payments. Our current system is more than sufficient, and I will not allow our deficit to skyrocket.
Despite what Mr. Cedar thinks, 400 euros is well below our nation's minimum wage, and such a low payment does nothing to reduce our seniors' financial dependence on their families. The application-based 600 euros is necessary, and we must support this plan.
It seems like we have a 4-to-1 vote, so we will be passing this proposal with both parts intact. Next, are there any other issues on the agenda that we'd like to discuss?
Well, we should take some time to discuss the treatment of Russian Estonians and other minorities in Estonia who make up 30% of our population and yet have an unemployment rate that is nearly double that of ethnic Estonians, which I find unacceptable.
The University of Tallinn has indicated that poor proficiency in the Estonian language directly lowers employment prospects. We already provide language education for the youth, but 1/5 of all current Russian adults are still not proficient in Estonian. Many of them can't afford to spend the time needed without falling into absolute poverty.
To help members of minority groups improve their language proficiency, we should first offer them the opportunity to take the Estonian language exam to test their fluency. If they do not pass, then they may attend one of our free language schools and receive the minimum wage of 500 euros a month in order to maintain a decent standard of living.
Mr. Ratas, we can actually expect many of these learners to continue to work part-time. I say these learners should only receive 250 euros, while those that are unemployed can receive the full 500 euros, preventing an unnecessary burden on our spending.
I have to agree with you, Mr. Cedar, as this will also protect the system from being abused by those who are only in it for extra income. We should also make the compensation expire after 3 years, giving learners an adequate amount of time to pick up the language without draining our spending, as shown on slide 17.
With that, let's take our final vote of the day to promote and regulate language education for members of minority groups who cannot speak Estonian. All in favor, please raise your hand. Well, it seems like we've finally come to a consensus. Today, we discussed the current economic situation in the Eurozone and investigated the issues of inequality and social mobility in Estonia. We proposed solutions to reduce old age poverty through resource centers and increased pension payments, as well as solutions to help members of minority groups with language learning programs. Thank you all for your time and input. Hyvasti.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for that presentation. We have a couple of questions to ask you. So the first question is, the 7.8% euro area unemployment rate hides low rates in some countries and high rates in others. What can euro area policymakers do to reduce the gap between countries with high and low rates?
So what you just mentioned is an example of labor market rigidity, which essentially is the difference in between the rates amongst different countries. As we mentioned with Estonia's low 4.4% unemployment rate compared to the Eurozone average. And much of this can specifically be blamed on unionization, which varies greatly across countries.
Another reason for why we may see these differences in unemployment rates is also due to education. As we mentioned earlier, Estonia has the highest PISA score in all of Europe, but many other countries do not have that sort of standard. And so because of that, we might see that workers will go to other nations to work instead of the one that they're currently living in because they're not able to find an adequate job for the skill level that they have.
In terms of policymakers, we have to consider that the Eurozone has a monetary union but fiscal disunion, meaning that the ECB uses a single monetary policy for all nations. However, each country has their independent fiscal policies. This plays a major role in the disparities that we see in the unemployment rate as they have differing fiscal policies. However, they can be used independently to close this disparity.
Okay, great, thank you. The second question is, if the euro area enters another recession while interest rates are still close to or below zero as they are now, how should policymakers respond?
Well, one way would be with the unconventional monetary policy of quantitative easing, which we've seen used in the past for the previous recession as well, in which the ECB would buy large amounts of long-term bonds in order to push down long-term yields and thus encourage more spending, since there's not so much that they can do with the short-term yields as they would already be close to 0%.
Additionally, one way that the ECB is doing this right now of encouraging spending is through TLTROs, which are targeted long-term refinancing operations, as we mentioned before, by setting the TLTRO 1 and 2. The ECB has noticed that it's stabilizing the economy. However, they're still uncertain to end these, so they are issuing another round of TLTROs as of next year to encourage more spending.
Just want to understand, so you're recommending dealing with some important social issues, inequality and poverty at the senior level, minorities, by redistributing income, by raising taxes and spending money on these social problems. I just want to make sure I understand. Do you actually argue that this is not going to hurt growth in Estonia, or that it is going to hurt growth and not much? And if so, how do you think about what would be an acceptable level of growth shortfall to actually still justify these programs?
We expect that second option that you mentioned there, where we will obviously see a slight decrease in growth, because at least in the short term, as we are increasing taxes, which for the rich, which may convince them to spend less money. However, in terms of the long term, our solutions will actually increase growth and keep Estonia on a solid path, which my colleagues will now explain.
specifically by helping people pursue higher earning jobs, by equipping them with the right skills and training. We're allowing them to pursue higher earning jobs. The more income that they make, the more that they can spend, which in the long term will add to the GDP of the country and allow it to grow.
Right, and since we still offer 0% interest on the reinvested earnings, and as well as many unique tax code benefits for many businesses, and as our government has invested rather heavily in entrepreneurial activity, we still expect business growth to be fairly robust and to keep up the economy.
And a major problem that we saw with raising the taxes was, of course, workers emigrating to other countries. So we analyzed that countries such as Latvia and Lithuania, which are neighboring countries of Estonia, their taxes on the highest bracket is 30%. So this is why we're making it instead of 25% to ensure that this does not become an issue.
Maybe a follow-up to Bruce's question. Estonia is a small open economy, and therefore is very sensitive to trade and foreign direct investment. Part of your measures will go to increase unit labor cost and therefore reduce the competitiveness of the economy. Do you see that as a disadvantage?
Could you repeat the
last
question?
part of the question?
Yeah, so the part of the redistribution will also lead to an increased minimum wage and this type of thing that will reduce the competitiveness. Do you see that as a disadvantage, a little bit a negative impact on growth that was mentioned in the previous question?
Well, currently, we see that 22.6% of the Estonian population is at risk of poverty. So anything to help them at least pick them up and put them on a level where they can support themselves, where we're not draining financial or the government welfare programs all toward them. We feel any way that we can redirect those toward progressing further in the nation as in technology, as to make further investments toward productivity can really help rather boost the economy, and we feel that it may cause some problems in the long term, but for right now, it's a necessary measure that we need to take.
In addition, we must note that wages in Estonia currently are still rather low and haven't fully recovered from the financial crisis of 2008. And we believe that by in the long term, this increase in wages that will happen with our solutions of social mobility won't hurt competition and growth in Estonia, because while in the short term we may see investment fall, consumption in the long term will grow.
You mentioned in your presentation the worsening old age dependency ratios, not just in Estonia, but in other European countries. Can you explain how that damages the prospects for future economic growth, and what are some ideas that a country might take to mitigate that damage?
The problem with having a high old age dependency ratio is now that it becomes a burden on the government to provide welfare programs and support the elderly, because of course they can't just ignore them. So by doing this, this takes away from potentially other spending that could help stimulate an economy.
And additionally, with the high old age dependency ratio, more people who are not working, the economy, the labor force is now shrinking and becoming less productive, so not able to contribute to the GDP, and which has negative impacts in the future.
And another problem that we see with the growing old age dependency ratio is when you look at pensions. So we're going to see that if this population continues to grow, that there are going to be less taxpayers that are going to be contributing to the pensions of these old age seniors. And so this is one problem that we saw in Estonia that we want to fix right now, and one problem that Mr. Ratas is also trying to fix right now. So in the future, the old age poverty rates won't be as high as we see right now.
Right, so while increasing birth rates is definitely a more long-term solution to having a high old age dependency ratio in the short term, Estonia has actually tried to get these older workers to become more productive and to be able to provide for themselves. So Mr. Ratas has implemented many reforms, such as more flexible working hours, allowing old agers to take to receive both a pension and work at the same time, and to provide basic job searching services, so that old age people who do want to switch from a more labor intensive job to one that's more suitable for them are able to, and thus keeping them working instead of fully reliant upon the government.
Thanks a lot. We have run out of time. Thanks to the Estonian authorities for the presentation.